It was a late evening flight, turbulence rocking the cabin lightly, but the tension inside was about to skyrocket. Most passengers were dozing off or scrolling on their phones, headphones in oblivious to the brewing storm. But one man seated in row 14 had clearly had enough of patience. Loud, brash, and slightly drunk, he kicked the seat in front of him repeatedly, glaring at the man sitting by the window like he owned the world. "Hey, old man, sit straight, or I'll teach you a lesson right now," he shouted, slurring his words. The cabin immediately went quiet. Phones were lifted, eyes widened. The flight attendants froze, unsure how to handle the escalating situation. The target of his outburst, calm as a still lake, slowly turned his head. Jeans, a simple black jacket, headphones draped around his neck. He looked almost ordinary at first glance, but there was a presence about him, a subtle intensity in the eyes, a silent confidence that made even the rowdy passenger hesitate for a split second. This was Seagal, martial arts legend, the kind of man whose calm could silence a storm. Next to him, almost invisible to the untrained eye, sat Manny Pacquiao, hood pulled low over his face, quietly reading. The legendary fighter and senator had been traveling incognito, avoiding the attention that often followed him everywhere. No one on the plane suspected that two of the most skilled fighters in the world were sitting just a few rows away from a man about to make the worst decision of his life. The passenger stomped closer, leaning over Stephen, waving his finger. "You think you're tough. You're just an old has-been. Nobody even knows who you are. Sit down, or I'll make you regret it." Stephen didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man with a calm, almost amused expression. "I don't want trouble," he said softly, his voice so quiet yet so commanding that it seemed to echo in the suddenly silent cabin. The man laughed, nervously at first, then aggressively. "No trouble? You think you can talk to me like that? You're about to find out who's boss." A few passengers began recording. Phones lifted. Whispers began spreading. And somewhere in the back, a flight attendant muttered under her breath, "Oh no, he has no idea who he's messing with." Little did the passenger know, the calm man sitting beside him was ready. Manny Pacquiao was watching, and the plane was about to witness a confrontation nobody would ever forget. The loud passenger, now visibly frustrated, clenched his fists. The cabin was completely silent except for the occasional rattling of overhead compartments from turbulence. Every eye was on row 14. Phones hovered midair, capturing the unfolding drama. He had misjudged the situation completely. This wasn't an ordinary traveler. This was a storm disguised as a man. "All right, that's it," he shouted, lunging slightly toward Steven Seagal. The seatbelt indicator blinked red, and the flight attendant stepped closer, ready to intervene. "You think I won't deal with you right here?" Stephen leaned back slightly, expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch. Yet the sheer calm in his presence created a magnetic tension, the kind of tension that makes even the most aggressive people pause, reconsider, and second-guess their choices. "You should know better," Stephen said, his voice low but commanding. "Not everything in life is a fight, and not every challenge needs an answer. Especially when you're outmatched without even realizing it." The man laughed nervously, trying to mask the flicker of doubt creeping into his eyes. "Outmatched? I don't care who you are. I've dealt with bigger guys than you." Manny Pacquiao, still standing quietly now, took a measured step forward. The hood fell back, revealing the focus and discipline of a world champion. His presence was subtle but unmistakable, like the calm before a hurricane. The passenger's bravado began to crumble, though he refused to show it. "Sir," the flight attendant warned softly, "please take your seat immediately. You're making everyone uncomfortable." "Seat? I don't take orders from anyone," the passenger barked, shoving forward again. But this time, the subtle changes in the cabin caught his attention. Every nearby passenger was leaning slightly back, instinctively giving space to the calm men in front. The energy in the air had shifted. Stephen finally stood, slow and deliberate. He didn't move aggressively, didn't shout. He just stood, towering slightly above the man, radiating an aura of complete control. "Step back," he said simply, not a threat, not a warning, just a statement. And yet, the words carried the weight of decades of martial arts mastery. The passenger froze, realizing, too late, that his challenge had been a colossal mistake. His anger wavered, replaced by a creeping fear he couldn't name. He looked to the side and noticed Manny Pacquiao stepping closer, calm but unmistakably ready. The passenger's knees went weak. Every instinct told him to retreat, but pride held him in place. "Easy there," Stephen continued, his voice almost a whisper, yet every word echoed through the cabin. "Sometimes arrogance blinds you to reality. Sometimes it blinds you to danger." The passenger glanced around. The flight attendants were tense but restrained. Phones were recording, and other passengers whispered, realizing the man had no clue who he had picked a fight with. It was only now, as he looked directly at Stephen and Manny, that the full weight of his mistake began to settle in. Manny Pacquiao stopped a few feet away, folding his arms calmly, the subtle confidence of a fighter who had faced hundreds of opponents, without ever needing to raise his voice emanated from him. The passenger's bravado shattered completely. I didn't know," he stammered. "You should always know," Stephen said softly, taking a half-step closer. "Know who you challenge, know what respect looks like, and know your limits." The passenger's breathing grew heavy. He realized that the flight had transformed from a routine journey into a tense classroom, where the lessons were delivered silently but unmistakably: respect, discipline, awareness. Passengers recorded in stunned silence as Stephen and Manny quietly asserted authority without violence. There were no punches, no threats, no shouting. Yet, the lesson was undeniable. The passenger had been defeated without a single blow. The atmosphere was electric, yet calm, a tension that only masters could create. The flight attendant, sensing it was now safe, stepped forward. "Sir, please sit down before this escalates any further." The man finally sank into his seat, hands trembling slightly, realizing he had been completely outmatched in the most subtle, controlled way possible. Stephen sat back down, adjusted his headphones, and Manny returned to his phone, hood back up. To anyone else, it looked like nothing had happened, but everyone on the plane knew otherwise. The silence that returned wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Passengers whispered, exchanged glances, and slowly lowered their phones. They had witnessed authority, respect, and power without violence, and the loud passenger, still trembling, now understood that appearances could be deceiving, and arrogance could be deadly. By the time the plane leveled out, the lesson had been delivered, and the story of row 14 was already beginning to spread among the loud passenger, now visibly frustrated, clenched his fists. The cabin was completely silent, except for the occasional rattling of overhead compartments from turbulence. Every eye was on row 14. Phones hovered midair, capturing the unfolding drama. He had misjudged the situation completely. This wasn't an ordinary traveler. This was a storm disguised as a man. "All right, that's it," he shouted, lunging slightly toward Steven Seagal. The seatbelt indicator blinked red, and the flight attendant stepped closer, ready to intervene. "You think I won't deal with you right here?" Steven leaned back slightly, expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, yet the sheer calm in his presence created a magnetic tension, the kind of tension that makes even the most aggressive people pause, reconsider, and second-guess their choices. "You should know better," Stephen said, his voice low but commanding. "Not everything in life is a fight, and not every challenge needs an answer, especially when you're outmatched without even realizing it." The man laughed nervously, trying to mask the flicker of doubt creeping into his eyes. "Outmatched? I don't care who you are. I've dealt with bigger guys than you." Manny Pacquiao, still standing quietly, now took a measured step forward. The hood fell back, revealing the focus and discipline of a world champion. His presence was subtle but unmistakable, like the calm before a hurricane. The passenger's bravado began to crumble, though he refused to show it. "Sir," the flight attendant warned softly, "please take your seat immediately. You're making everyone uncomfortable." "Seat, I don't take orders from anyone." The passenger barked, shoving forward again. But this time, the subtle changes in the cabin caught his attention. Every nearby passenger was leaning slightly back, instinctively giving space to the calm men in front. The energy in the air had shifted. Stephen finally stood, slow and deliberate. He didn't move aggressively, didn't shout. He just stood, towering slightly above the man, radiating an aura of complete control. Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement. And yet, the words carried the weight of decades of martial arts mastery. The passenger froze, realizing, too late, that his challenge had been a colossal mistake. His anger wavered, replaced by a creeping fear he couldn't name. He looked to the side and noticed Manny Pacquiao stepping closer, calm but unmistakably ready. The passenger's knees went weak. Every instinct told him to retreat, but pride held him in place. "Easy there," Stephen continued. His voice almost a whisper, yet every word echoed through the cabin. Sometimes arrogance blinds you to reality. Sometimes it blinds you to danger. The passenger glanced around. The flight attendants were tense but restrained. Phones were recording, and other passengers whispered. Realizing the man had no clue who he had picked a fight with, it was only now, as he looked directly at Stephen and Manny, that the full weight of his mistake began to settle in. Manny Pacquiao stopped a few feet away, folding his arms calmly. The subtle confidence of a fighter who had faced hundreds of opponents without ever needing to raise his voice emanated from him. The passenger's bravado shattered completely. I didn't know," he stammered. "You should always know," Stephen said softly, taking a half step closer. "Know who you challenge. Know what respect looks like and know your limits." The passenger's breathing grew heavy. He realized that the flight had transformed from a routine journey into a tense classroom, where the lessons were delivered silently but unmistakably. Respect, discipline, awareness. Passengers recorded in stunned silence as Stephen and Manny quietly asserted authority without violence. There were no punches, no threats, no shouting. Yet, the lesson was undeniable. The passenger had been defeated without a single blow. The atmosphere was electric, yet calm, a tension that only masters could create. The flight attendant, sensing it was now safe, stepped forward. "Sir, please sit down before this escalates any further." The man finally sank into his seat, hands trembling slightly, realizing he had been completely outmatched in the most subtle, controlled way possible. Stephen sat back down, adjusted his headphones, and Manny returned to his phone, hood back up. To anyone else, it looked like nothing had happened, but everyone on the plane knew otherwise. The silence that returned wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Passengers whispered, exchanged glances, and slowly lowered their phones. They had witnessed authority, respect, and power without violence, and the loud passenger, still trembling, now understood that appearances could be deceiving, and arrogance could be deadly. By the time the plane leveled out, the lesson had been delivered, and the story of Row 14 was already beginning to spread among the passengers. No one on that flight would forget the night they watched a confrontation handled with unmatched skill, discipline, and silent authority. The cabin had returned to a tense silence, but it was different now. It wasn't ordinary awkwardness. It was a charged, almost reverent quiet. The kind that only comes after witnessing a subtle yet undeniable display of authority. Every passenger knew something extraordinary had just occurred, though no one could fully articulate what. Phones that had been recording Row 14 were lowered slowly, their screens showing Seagal and Manny Pacquiao, calm and composed as if nothing had happened. The loud passenger, now seated and visibly shaken, avoided eye contact with anyone, staring down at his lap, mumbling under his breath. The reality of his mistake was beginning to sink in. He had picked a fight with two of the most dangerous and disciplined people in the world, and survived only because restraint had been shown. A young woman seated nearby whispered to her friend, "Did you see that? He just sat there, and didn't even react." And Pacquiao, he didn't even raise his voice. Her voice was trembling with awe. Others nodded, quietly agreeing, their eyes glued to the duo in Row 14. The flight attendants, relieved that the confrontation had ended without physical escalation, moved cautiously down the aisle, checking on passengers and discreetly signaling to the cabin crew that the situation was under control. Still, the tension lingered like a heavy cloud. Everyone on that flight had felt the authority, discipline, and silent danger that two legends naturally exuded. The loud passenger's confidence had evaporated completely. He glanced surreptitiously at Stephen, then Manny, and realized with growing horror that he had no idea who he had been confronting. Panic was setting in. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, noticing for the first time how alert and disciplined the two men were. Even their smallest movements carried weight. Every subtle glance and calm breath suggested they were ready to act if absolutely necessary, but their choice to hold back amplified the threat far more than aggression ever could. A middle-aged man seated across the aisle muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding me. That guy, he didn't even touch him, and the guy's shaking like a leaf. That's insane." Phones remained half raised as more passengers whispered to each other. Social media posts were already being drafted mid-flight. Some were capturing the first glimpses of the encounter. Others were quietly taking notes, impressed by the way two men had dominated a room without a single raised hand. Stephen adjusted his headphones again, calm as ever, while Manny leaned back, hood partially covering his face. The contrast between the passengers' loud panic and the pair's serene composure was stark. It was a lesson in control, restraint, and the quiet authority that comes from experience and mastery. As the plane hummed steadily through the night sky, subtle glances between passengers began. Some were curious, some were admiring, but all were now hyper, aware that two of the most disciplined men in the world were seated within their row. The air was electric with unspoken respect, mixed with the lingering fear of the man who had challenged them. The passenger tried to rationalize his behavior, muttering excuses, but the weight of reality pressed down. He had underestimated his targets completely. Stephen's calm had disarmed him more effectively than any confrontation ever could. Manny's quiet vigilance only reinforced that the passenger's actions had been reckless. Meanwhile, in the back of the cabin, an older passenger nudged his companion, whispering, "I swear I've seen that face before." But where? The hint of recognition sparked curiosity among a few others. Eyes flickered toward Stephen and Manny, sensing that there was more beneath the surface than what met the eye. The tension now carried not just caution but anticipation. Something bigger was coming, and everyone aboard felt it. Passengers were no longer whispering about discomfort or turbulence. They were talking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Social media captions began forming in people's heads, like, "Two legends handled a drunk passenger like it was nothing," and "I can't believe I just saw Steven Seagal and Manny Pacquiao in the same row." The loud passenger, meanwhile, sat frozen. He realized that the fight he had picked was already lost in every sense that mattered. Not with fists, but with the undeniable weight of presence, skill, and composure. He stared ahead, sweat forming on his brow, and quietly prayed the flight would end soon. And then, subtle hints began to ripple through the cabin. A flight attendant whispered to a colleague, Isn't that Manny Pacquiao?" A passenger muttered, "That's definitely Seagal." Recognition started to spread. Slowly, the pieces were connecting in everyone's mind. The man who had instigated the conflict hadn't just faced anyone. He had faced legends. The plane seemed smaller now, the hum of engines fading into the background as anticipation and awareness filled every corner. Everyone was waiting for the next move, but Stephen and Manny remained perfectly composed. Their silent authority was louder than any voice could be, foreshadowing a reveal that would leave the cabin shocked, humbled, and talking about this flight for years to come. The plane's hum seemed to fade into the background as whispers grew louder. Passengers craned their necks, phones raised, capturing every detail of the unfolding moment. Steven Seagal sat back in his seat, calm, headphones around his neck, eyes scanning the cabin with quiet authority. Manny Pacquiao leaned back in his chair, hood partially down, the intensity in his eyes undeniable. The loud passenger in row 14 shifted nervously. Sweat formed on his brow as he glanced around, trying to gauge the reactions of the other travelers. Panic had replaced bravado, though he refused to admit it. He had thought he could dominate, intimidate, and teach a lesson. Instead, he was cornered by presence alone, unsure if these calm men were even capable of violence, or just patience. Then, the flight attendant's voice cut through the tense murmur. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely, addressing the passenger. "You need to step aside. Please follow me." The passenger hesitated. "Wait. Why?" She gestured toward the exit row. "For your safety and theirs." He swallowed hard, confusion and fear battling within him. That's when Stephen finally spoke, his voice calm yet deliberate, carrying across the cabin. "Sir, I suggest you cooperate. It's for the best." The man's face turned pale. I didn't know." Manny Pacquiao's hood was now fully off. The calm, almost serene expression revealed the unmistakable eyes of a world champion. He gave the passenger a slow, measured nod, as if reading his every thought. The realization hit the passenger like a punch. He had challenged two of the most disciplined, skilled fighters alive. His bravado evaporated instantly. A collective murmur spread through the cabin. Phones were raised higher, whispers escalating. "Is that really Manny Pacquiao? That's Steven Seagal. No way. Oh my God." Passengers began connecting the dots. The subtle reactions of the cabin, the way the air shifted, the quiet authority exuded by the two men. It all made sense now. The passenger's jaw tightened, panic overtaking his confusion. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, apologize, beg for mercy. But pride and shame warred within him. At that moment, the senior flight marshal stepped forward, escorted by two crew members. "Sir," he said firmly, "please follow us. You need to leave the cabin immediately." The passenger's legs shook. "Leave? But Steven Seagal interrupted softly but with unshakable authority. "It's time you understood the consequences of arrogance and disrespect. Sometimes the lesson doesn't need a fist, it needs awareness," Manny Pacquiao added, quietly. "And sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never show aggression unless necessary." The passenger's eyes darted around the cabin phones. Whispers and wide eyes confirmed his humiliation. He had not only underestimated the men, but also misjudged the entire environment. The quiet display of mastery had been far more intimidating than any act of aggression. As he was escorted toward the exit, murmurs from passengers followed him. He didn't know who he was messing with. "I can't believe he tried that. That was amazing." The passenger tried to hold his head high, but every step echoed the lesson he had just learned. Respect is earned, not assumed. Meanwhile, Steven sat back down, adjusting his headphones. Expression calm, Manny Pacquiao leaned back, hood up, eyes scanning the cabin once more, ensuring no lingering tension remained. The flight returned to its hum, but the energy had irrevocably changed. Every passenger had witnessed an unforgettable lesson in discipline, respect, and authority. The loud passenger, now seated in the exit row temporarily, could barely meet anyone's gaze. He realized he had walked onto the plane like a king and left as a humbled man. The weight of his mistake was crushing. His mind raced with self-recrimination. "I challenged two legends. I thought I was powerful. I was nothing." A passenger behind whispered to a friend, voice trembling, "I've never seen anything like that." They didn't even hit him, and he was terrified. Phones continued recording, capturing the lingering aura of authority that Steven and Manny radiated. The rest of the flight went smoothly, but the story of Row 14 spread like wildfire. Passengers recounted the events in hushed tones, already imagining the social media posts, the captions, the shock of friends and family who wouldn't believe it. Everyone understood what had happened. The loud passenger had picked the wrong fight, and the most powerful lesson wasn't in violence, but in the calm, silent mastery of two living legends. By the time the plane landed, the incident had cemented itself as the defining story of the flight. Steven and Manny exited quietly, unnoticed by most, leaving behind only awe, whispers, and the undeniable reminder: arrogance can be a dangerous companion when matched against discipline and skill. The passenger, still pale and shaken, finally muttered to himself, "I will never underestimate anyone again." And with that, the cabin settled back into routine. But the memory of what had just happened would haunt everyone aboard Row 14 for a lifetime. The plane had landed smoothly, the hum of the engines replaced by the murmur of passengers gathering their belongings. Row 14 remained the epicenter of whispered discussions. The loud passenger, now pale and trembling, tried to straighten his tie and regain composure, though it was clear that his confidence had been completely shattered. Every step he took toward the exit felt heavier, burdened by the lessons he had just learned. Steven Seagal and Manny Pacquiao stood calmly in the aisle, adjusting jackets and backpacks. Their movements were deliberate but unassuming, a sharp contrast to the chaos they had quelled without raising a fist. Passengers instinctively gave them space, a silent acknowledgement of their authority and experience. The loud passenger was approached by the senior flight marshal, who had escorted him off the plane earlier. "Sir, you will be reported for your disruptive behavior," the marshal said firmly, though with professional calm. The man swallowed hard, nodding silently. He had no argument, no bravado left. The words of Stephen and Manny, the silence, and the controlled presence of two legends had dismantled his arrogance completely. Seagal spoke quietly to the marshal as the passenger was led away. "It's not about punishment. It's about understanding consequences and respect. That's the real lesson." Manny nodded in agreement, adding, "Sometimes the best way to teach someone isn't through force, it's through awareness of their actions." Back in the cabin, passengers continued to murmur in low tones. Phones buzzed with recordings and clips ready to be shared online. Social media posts would later flood the internet. Passenger picks a fight with Seagal and Manny Pacquiao. Total meltdown. Or two legends handled a drunk passenger silently. Unbelievable. The event had cemented itself in the memories of everyone on board. A few passengers approached Stephen quietly. "Thank you for staying calm," one woman whispered. "You didn't even raise your voice." Stephen gave a faint nod, serene but composed. Manny offered a small smile to those who acknowledged him, his demeanor quiet but commanding respect. There was no arrogance, only the quiet authority of men who had mastered their craft. Meanwhile, the old flight attendant who had been present throughout the confrontation watched silently. She had seen passengers get unruly before, but never like this. The incident had been controlled, decisive, and final. "I've worked flights for 20 years, she whispered to a colleague, "and I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that without anyone getting hurt." The loud passenger, now outside the cabin, slumped into a chair in the airport waiting area. He replayed every moment in his head, the calm demeanor, the quiet authority, the subtle glances from Manny, the measured steps of Stephen. His ego had been shattered, replaced by a stark awareness of humility. For the first time in years, he truly understood the meaning of respect. As Stephen and Manny exited through the gate, passengers followed at a distance, still in awe. Conversations continued. "Did you see the way he just stood there? Pacquiao didn't even need to say anything, and the guy froze. I can't believe we just witnessed that." The story would live on, retold countless times. The loud passenger finally muttered under his breath, "I'll never forget this. I've learned my lesson." It was more than fear. It was recognition of something deeper. Respect isn't forced, it's earned. Discipline isn't loud. It's quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. And the strongest people often speak the least, letting their presence and actions carry the message. In the calm aftermath, the plane emptied slowly. Stephen and Manny moved silently, leaving behind a cabin transformed by their presence. The lesson was clear. Arrogance can crumble in the face of mastery, patience, and quiet authority. True power doesn't demand attention, it commands it. By the time the airport terminal had cleared, passengers were already recounting the story to friends, family, and fellow travelers. The incident would be remembered not as a fight, but as a lesson in humility, restraint, and awareness. Everyone who witnessed Row 14 that night would carry the lesson with them. Respect should never be assumed. Arrogance is dangerous, and strength often lies in quiet control rather than force. Even as the plane emptied and the passenger moved toward his next flight, he could feel the weight of his mistake. The memory of Stephen's calm gaze and Manny's quiet authority lingered like a shadow, a permanent reminder that some lessons are learned best the hard way. And in that lingering silence, one undeniable truth remained. The strongest and most dangerous people aren't those who raise their fists. They're the ones who sit silently, waiting, and let the world realize it in its own time. The plane was emptying, passengers moving toward baggage claim and the taxi lines. Yet the echoes of what had happened in Row 14 lingered like a persistent shadow. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones, people retelling the story to friends, strangers marveling at the quiet display of authority they had witnessed. Phones were still out, videos being shared online, captions forming in real time. But beyond the viral potential, there was a deeper lesson. one that wouldn't be found in views or likes, but in the understanding of respect, humility, and discipline. The loud passenger, now seated in the airport waiting area, replayed the events over and over in his mind. He had come onto the plane full of confidence, armed with arrogance, and the belief that he could intimidate anyone. Instead, he had been confronted not by force, but by quiet authority. Steven Seagal and Manny Pacquiao had taught him the hardest lesson of all. True power is silent. True respect is earned, not demanded. The passenger's palms still trembled as he thought about how easily his bravado had crumbled. He realized that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who shout, who shove, who try to dominate. The strongest people are those who wait, observe, and act only when necessary. He had challenged men who had mastered themselves in ways he could barely comprehend, and in doing so, he had been humbled completely. Steven and Manny had left the plane quietly, unnoticed by most of the airport crowd. No one cheered, no one rushed forward to take selfies. Their lesson wasn't in spectacle. It was in subtlety, in presence, in restraint, and that was what made the encounter unforgettable. True mastery doesn't need to prove itself through aggression. It simply exists, and everyone else recognizes it instinctively. Across the cabin and terminal, whispers spread. That was incredible. They didn't even touch him, and the guy was terrified. I've never seen anyone command a room like that without shouting. People shared stories, laughs, and gasps as the realization settled in. Respect is more powerful than fear, humility more impressive than aggression, and patience stronger than any brute force. The passenger, still pale and shaking, muttered quietly to himself, "I will never forget this. I've learned my lesson. I won't underestimate anyone again." It was more than fear. It was insight, the kind that changes behavior permanently. Some lessons leave bruises. This one left understanding. For the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation, the night became a subtle lesson in observation. They had seen the difference between arrogance and discipline, impulsiveness and control, noise and calm authority. Everyone had learned something, whether they realized it immediately or would recognize it years later in moments when patience and restraint mattered more than aggression. The story of Row 14 spread quickly, not only for the entertainment value but because it carried a universal truth. Arrogance blinds, discipline commands, and the quietest actions often speak the loudest. In every retelling, the moral resonated. Respect isn't about status, wealth, or bravado. It's about recognizing the value in others and acting with humility, even when no one is watching. Even as the airport cleared and the night deepened, the memory of what had occurred lingered. The loud passenger would remember it for the rest of his life. The other passengers would carry the story like a cautionary tale, one that would be recounted countless times on flights, at offices, and at gatherings. Steven and Manny had walked away without acknowledgement, yet the weight of their presence lingered far longer than any words could have. And so, the moral of the encounter became clear to everyone who had witnessed it. True strength is silent. True authority is calm. True respect is earned through character, not intimidation. In a world where people rush to prove themselves, the quiet ones, the disciplined ones, and the humble masters often leave the deepest impression. Type respect in the comments if you believe humility is the greatest strength. Share where you're watching from, and let everyone know that patience, discipline, and quiet authority are more powerful than arrogance or aggression. Remember, one day the person you underestimate might be the very one teaching you the most important lesson of your life.